Greetings. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the power of incumbency when it comes to primaries and evaluating the whole primary process as a whole, talking about its strengths and its weaknesses. This is the third video I've done so far on US elections, looking at the whole process of US presidential elections, all the way from the invisible primary to inauguration. Now, we've looked at incumbency before when we talked about Congress, and an incumbent is a person who currently holds office. It could be a president, could be a senator. And the incumbent always has a huge inbuilt advantage in a primary and also actually in the main election itself. And when you look back at the history of presidential elections and at the history of congressional elections, it is very rare for an incumbent to lose an election. And it is almost unheard of for them to lose a primary. Just work that one through in your head. So it's very rare for them to, and for an incumbent to lose an election, like the general election, Senate election, and it's almost unheard of an incumbent to lose primary. One example of an incumbent losing would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Obviously, she wasn't the incumbent; she was the challenger. She managed to get out the Democratic incumbent senator in the primary and then went on to win the general election. So it can happen, but incredibly rare. Now, most incumbents aren't challenged in primaries, and I'm talking about both senators and presidents here, and even when they are, they usually get 90% plus of the vote. Now, there isn't always an incumbent, so think it through. A president can only serve 2 terms, so every 8 years, there is going to be an election with no incumbent, but every 4, there will be an incumbent if that particular president decides they want to kind of stand again. So there isn't always an incumbent. And when an incumbent stands, such as Obama did in 2012, halfway through his term, Bill Clinton did in 1996, halfway through his term, double check that one, they nearly always completely wipe out their opposition. And I do not have an example for you of a president who loses in a primary, an incumbent president who loses in the primary, because there isn't one. I mean, there might be one if you go way back, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know. I haven't looked back that far. There is not one in the modern era. There have been a few challenges. I mean, I've got an entertaining story here where this felon actually managed to get a whole bunch of votes versus Obama back in 2012 in a particular state, but he was never really a threat. And some of you might already be thinking, well, hang on a minute, well, is Donald Trump facing a primary? The short answer is yes, but the truthful answer is he's not really under threat. And when Donald Trump first became president, people were saying, oh, well, he's definitely going to face an incumbent challenge from Republicans. Because remember, Trump isn't really a traditional Republican. In many ways, the Republican Party has moved to Trump rather than Trump moving to the Republicans. And so lots of people were saying, well, there's no way Trump won't face a challenge from someone like Ted Cruz or other major Republican figures. But it hasn't happened. He does have a few challenges. We've got someone called Joe Walsh here. We've got Bill Weld, who's actually been a nominee from before. And he did have a fairly major candidate contender, which is a man called Mark Sanford. But he's pulled out. And in fact, many states have actually announced that they will not be holding a primary this time on the Republican side. You'll also note there haven't been any Republican primary debates taking place. So the media oxygen for any of these Republican candidates has kind of been pushed down. To be blunt, it just isn't going to happen. Even if there is a vote, which there will be in certain states, Donald Trump is going to win. The only exception, of course, would be if this impeachment trial goes differently, or if he is impeached by that stage. There's a possibility then that, of course, he might withdraw, and then there would be a usual primary, or he might face a challenge there. But realistically, incumbents do not face primary challenges. There are a couple of exceptions that are worth discussing here. Because in 1992, in 1976, and in 1980, there was a fierce primary competition. I wrote there, will Trump face one? I wrote that last year. At that point, people were still saying it might happen. It just hasn't. In each one of those cases, the president won the primary. As I've talked about, the president did manage to get most of the vote. But they then went on to lose the general election. Let's give you an example here. This is the 1976 election. In 1976, Gerald Ford, the man over the far right, was president. He'd taken over after Richard Nixon had resigned over Watergate, and he faced a very strong challenge from a man who you may well recognise, Ronald Reagan, who's also over the right-hand side. And there was a fierce competition, but Gerald Ford secured the re-nomination at that time, fought the election, but lost the election. The man on the left is the man who defeated him. The man on the left is Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter won in 1976, and then Jimmy Carter actually faced his own nomination challenge, primary challenge, in 1980. Again, the incumbent president won that primary challenge, but he went on to lose the election. The next example, if I go back to the previous slide, the next example is in 1992, Bush 41, so George Bush's dad, who's also called George Bush. He faced a fierce primary in 1992. Again, the president won, but went on to lose the general election. Now, there's two ways that you can read this. You could say that every time a president faces a fierce primary challenge, they're so damaged by it that they go on to lose the election. That's a valid way of reading that. The other way of reading it is that weak presidents are already weak and they're going to lose the election, and therefore they face strong primary challenges. Think about the different way around that goes. I've written it out here in green. It might be behind my head, but it says, do unpopular presidents face tough primaries, or do tough primaries make unpopular presidents? There's a really interesting article on this here, which I can link you to. I'll put it in the description, which is called something along those lines. It's called Could Trump Lose the Republican Nomination? Here's the history of primary challenges to incumbent presidents. Really interesting read. Takes you through the examples that I've just done, as well as adding more examples kind of to that. But in terms of your essays, you can kind of say, well, basically, incumbent presidents don't face challenges, but when they do, they often seem to be quite damaging, and you can use the examples that I have there to back that up. So, how about turnout? How does turnout affect primaries, affect results, affect democracy, and so on? Well, if you remember from the last video, there's two types of primary. There's the primary version itself, little elections, and then there's caucuses, which are these like town hall kind of meetings. Caucuses always have an incredibly low turnout. Think about it, like in order to go to a caucus, you've got to give up a whole evening, maybe a whole day. It's going to be an hour-long meeting or hours-long meeting, at the end of which there's going to be voting and perhaps voting again, especially on the Democrat side where they have to kind of physically move around a room to vote. So caucuses have a very low turnout, which means very few people actually get to make that individual decision. Primary voters don't tend to be the same group of people as the general election. General elections tend to have a relatively strong turnout from a range of groups of people, whereas primary voters tend to be like your kind of hardcore, real like people that are really into politics. Basically, you and me, you know, the kind of real politicos. They tend to be better educated, they tend to have a higher income, and they tend to be older. Maybe that's what gives them time to go to caucuses, but this is primaries as a whole. The voters tend to be better educated, higher and older. Open primaries attack more. I talked a little about this in the previous video. Open primaries, for all the weird idea that Democrats can vote for the Republican candidate and vice versa, strange though that might be, open primaries attract a far higher turnout, which does give a difference to the legitimacy and to the popularity or the perceived momentum of a candidate. When there is a close race, there tends to be a higher turnout. So when, for example, you have, say, Barack Obama versus Hillary Clinton, and both candidates are seen as potential candidates, that tends to push the turnout up. When it's a done deal, such as maybe Trump's challenge, the turnout goes down because people don't feel their vote matters. It kind of makes sense. And of course, if the nomination has already been decided, there is a tiny turnout. How could that happen? Well, remember the primary process takes place over a number of months. At some point during that process, one candidate will either be the only one left or will have received so many votes that there's no way they can be defeated. And so at that point, there are going to be a few states left whose votes effectively do not matter. And of course, then at that point, the turnout just disappears through the floor, because why would you take time to go out and vote knowing your vote won't count? So turnout is something you can discuss. So if you get a question that says, to what extent is the primary process useful, important, representative, an appropriate way of selecting a president, you can talk about the different aspects, caucuses and primaries, but also talk about, well, do people actually get involved? You know, what is the turnout? I haven't got any for this particular PowerPoint, but go and find some statistics as well. You know, what percentage of Americans actually vote in the primaries, and be able to kind of rattle off a couple of figures. That would kind of make the idea stronger. So let's look at the primary process as a whole. So I don't just mean primary votes. I mean primaries and caucuses and open and closed and the invisible primary and so on. You know, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Because we don't have it in the UK. Remember, in the UK, whichever leader is already leader of the political parties, they just go on automatically to kind of be their party's prime ministerial candidate. So America is reasonably unique in having this primary process, this selection process to go through. So what's good about it? Well, I've said the turnout's low, but it does lead to increased participation because people get to vote again and again over a period of time to give their views not only on whether it should be Democrat and Republican, but which Democrat and which Republican. And that is surely more democratic. It does lead to more input. It does lead to, use the phrase, increased participation of people in choosing their political leaders. And one of the things that's come up again and again over the last few years in British politics is people saying they're politically homeless. There is a kind of group of people in the middle now that don't particularly feel like Corbyn's Labour and don't particularly feel like Johnson's Conservatives, and they kind of go, well, where do I go? If we had a primary process, follow the chain of thought here, those people every 4 years would be able to have their voice when selecting candidates for parties or candidates for leadership. So it would lead to increased choice and increased participation. And also it gives in a way real choice as well. Hopefully you've already noticed by now that leaders matter. Like Corbyn's Labour Party and Blair's Labour Party, not the same thing. Johnson's Conservative Party, Cameron's Conservative Party, not the same thing, especially when it comes to Brexit. So by holding primaries, you lead to increased choice. You allow for people to democratically say, this is where we want the Conservative Party, the Democrat Party, to be going. This is the direction we want them to take for the next however many years. And in some cases, you have a huge choice. 22 candidates in 2016. The Democratic primary, which has been going on for the last couple of years and is just about to begin in terms of not the actual vote in Iowa, has got a huge amount of candidates. You've got the well-known ones such as Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, but you've got loads of others. I'm looking at my wall display here. You've got you've got Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand. You know, many of these have dropped out, but at one point there were huge amounts of candidates that people could choose from. This is very different. It's also open to outsiders. Now, if you want to be Prime Minister of Great Britain, good luck to you. You would have to join one of the main political parties. You would have to go and attend lots of meetings. You'd have to make a little name for yourself. You'd have to become a candidate for an election. And I don't mean for Prime Minister, I mean just for the party, just to be an MP. You'd have to win that election. You'd have to then start up the kind of the career ladder in Parliament. You'd probably have to be a member of the cabinet or the shadow cabinet, a junior minister. You'd then have to become maybe a more senior minister. You'd then have to wait for there to be a vacancy in the party leadership, and they don't come along all that often. You'd then have to win that leadership election to your party, and then beyond that, you'd have to win a general election as well. This is a huge process that means that actually only political insiders become leaders of political parties in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn, you could argue, is an exception, but he's not a political outsider. He's been in politics all his life. He just hasn't been perhaps part of the kind of the leadership bubble, but he is part of politics. But what a primary allows you to do is it throws the decision away from the party and back to the people and says, okay, well, who do you want? And this allows outsiders like Barack Obama, who was not seen as a potential candidate really before 2006 was when he started to kind of make his name. It allowed him to shoot into the picture very, very quickly. And of course, Donald Trump, who has never held elected office in his life, to become firstly the Republican candidate and then the Republican president. So the for all of you who are sick of politics or don't trust politicians, a primary allows for new people, other candidates to come in. There was a book written last year, I think it was by Isabel Hardman, called "Why We Don't Get the Politicians We Need," or "Why We Get the Politicians We Deserve," or something like that. And there is a kind of a feeling sometimes that we don't have politicians we trust or that we can relate to. And maybe actually by not having a primary system, we deny ourselves the possibility to get candidates that we genuinely feel an affinity with. I'm trying to make the case for primaries over this side, and when I get to that side, I'll try and really knock down as well. So I'm deliberately going to be biased on kind of both sides. So hopefully at the moment you're feeling very positive towards primaries, but don't worry, we'll soon kind of change that. The other important thing about primaries is it's a grueling test, and I've got a UK example for you here, but it will hopefully make sense to you. When you go through the primary process, you have to go through that invisible primary of campaigning and raising funds and so on. You then have to have a whole load of TV debates against your own side. You have to win those debates. You have to win that election. You have to really prove yourself. The media will investigate you when you are a primary candidate. Journalists will interview you, ask you difficult questions. You will be put underneath the microscope, and you will have to pass that test if you are going to make it through the primary process. There was a famous example of someone who dropped out. Their name has just escaped me. Rick Perry, I think it was. I'll double check that one. He was a presidential candidate back in 2016, I think it was. And he wanted to abolish 3 departments. And the interviewer said, so what's your plans? And he said, I want to abolish 3 departments: the Department of Energy, the Department of Environment, and he couldn't remember the third. It's easily done. It's under pressure, and you forget something. But it showed that he had a weakness of memory. It showed that when put under pressure, he struggled, and so candidates like him kind of fell to one side when they were tested. Now, here's my example. Sorry if you're a fan. Theresa May in the UK, when she became leader of the Conservative Party, if you remember, she never actually really had to stand for election. There were elections amongst MP, but it was supposed to come down to a test between her and a lady called Andrea Leadsom, and they were going in head to head, and there was due to be a period of campaigning by both candidates. However, Andrea Leadsom screwed up, and she made an interview where she implied that Theresa May would be wouldn't be as good a prime minister because she didn't have children. She didn't actually use that phrase, but there was an implication, and Andrea Leadsom dropped out. Theresa May became prime minister. Then Theresa May stood in the general election. Do you remember this? 2017, and she fell apart. She appeared to be confused. She made U-turns. She didn't do very well in that campaign. Maybe because she was never put under the test properly of campaigning. So maybe the other advantage of this primary process is it stops unsuitable candidates getting to the general election. Because if you're a Democrat and you want the Democrats to win, then you want there to be a candidate who's not going to just screw up at that position. The same goes if you're a Republican. And the primary process allows you to test these candidates carefully as time goes on. So it's brilliant. We love the primary process. Or do we? Let's go on the other side. Look, it's so long. Turnout isn't great, although it does lead to increased participation in a way. I already said in the last slide, caucus turnout is low, and primary turnout as a whole is pretty low as well. So caucus turnout is very low, and primary participation is low. Many voters don't care. The media cares because the media loves a good story and a good competition, but it's incredibly long, this process. It goes on, as I think I said in the previous video, it can go on the invisible primary can go on for years. The actual primary process itself starts in February and doesn't finish until you get to the proper general election campaign, which is coming up in kind of October. So it's a very long, drawn-out process, and people will get apathetic, bored, dull, done with it, etc., etc. It's also ultimately decided by unrepresentative voters. Think to the previous slide, older, whiter, highly educated people tend to be the people that vote, which means it isn't really America choosing, it's a particular group of people choosing. Now, some candidates break through that, and Donald Trump again would be one of those people who he wasn't voted for by traditional Republican voters. So maybe the system is fine because actually when certain candidates come along, they can get different people to vote. But the vast majority of the time, it's only a particular group of voters that make that case. Again, here, the process can literally take years if the voters will end up apathetic. If you go from the beginning of the invisible primary, whenever that blurry time might be, to the point of inauguration, you are looking at years. And so you're spending most of the presidential time thinking about the next president. Now, to put this into crystal kind of clarity, I was looking at the timeline here. And yeah, here we go. Donald Trump announced his candidacy for a second term on February the 18th, 2017. He became president in January 2017. So 1 month after Donald Trump became president, he announced that he was going to be the candidate in the next election. That's how long he's kind of been campaigning for his next kind of primary or next presidential election. In a way, it kind of never stops. And so it's incredibly expensive. Every candidate has to do their individual fundraising. Every candidate then has to do their own rallies, their own adverts, their own travel around America, their own leaflets, their own appearances on TV shows, radio shows, etc., etc., etc. A huge amount of money goes into this. So rather than a party that has a leader and they can put all of their funds into promoting, say, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, funds for Democrats are split massively between all the different Democratic candidates. So instead of all the Democrats being able to focus on Donald Trump, attacking Donald Trump, at the moment the Democrats are focused on fighting themselves. Which Democrat will be that? And that goes for their money as well as their time and their effort. It's incredibly expensive and really does kind of distract from what the other things that they could be doing. It's very dominated by the media. As you're probably aware, the media latches on to quotes that people say, and Donald Trump in many ways was kind of a creation of the media. You had traditional candidates in 2015 and 16 who were going out and doing their rallies and making their traditional things, but Donald Trump would just go out and say something like Mexicans are rapists, and the media would go, oh my goodness, rah, 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 rah. But they would give him huge amounts of written space in their newspapers or their websites, and they would report it on TV. And in many ways, Donald Trump used the media to campaign. Of course, he is a media star. Think the Apprentice and so on. So one of the reasons why Donald Trump is not facing a serious primary challenge this time is because the media is spending no time looking at these primary challenges. They're all looking at the impeachment or Iran or the Democratic primary. So the media is incredibly powerful. And if they pay no attention to a candidate, that candidate is very unlikely to have much success. And that's, again, something you can talk about as a problem with the process. Fights can get personal. So primaries, recap, it's Republican versus Republican. It's Democrat versus Democrat. And for 2 years or more, they're going to be tearing chunks, not out of each other, but the other party, but their own party. Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama for a year went head to head. Donald Trump versus, I've forgotten his name. Ted Cruz got really personal, really nasty for a year or so. And if these fights get personal, how are you then suddenly going to go, oh great, well we're all Republicans, let's carry on and win this general election. Oh great, we're all in the same team. And if you think back, it can be fine. Like if you think back to Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Hunt, when they campaigned against each other in the summer just gone, they tried to do it very, very nicely. It was a very well-behaved fight. So afterwards, although Jeremy Hunt refused to serve in his cabinet, the Conservative Party was more or less able to kind of carry on. But primaries can get really, really savage, to the point that Ted Cruz never endorsed Donald Trump to be president. He never came out and said, I understand I've lost, but I still support Donald Trump to be president of the United States because he's a Republican and I'm a Republican. He never said that. Bernie Sanders eventually endorsed Hillary, but it took him a long time to do so, and people wondered if he ever would. So a bigger disadvantage of this whole process is that you're putting a kind of a scar internally to your own party before you ever even think about taking on the other party. And if I just skip to my last point here, and then I'll go back on, it actually damages all candidates because every single candidate is going to have chunks torn out of them by their own party before they are put forward. And if you think about how, say, damaged Jeremy Corbyn was by the fights within his own party before coming to the general election, it makes a leader look weak. It highlights their weaknesses before you're ever going to go to the general kind of population. And that perhaps was one of the problems that Hillary had. Hillary wasn't very popular amongst her own party. I mean, she was popular enough to get the nomination, but she wasn't universally loved. And having someone like Bernie Sanders, who actually is quite popular and charismatic as her opponent, really weakened her by the time she actually came to kind of stand. So you could make an argument that although the primary process tests all candidates, it actually damages all candidates. So depending which way you want to argue those, I'd probably put those 2 points together, and whichever way you want to argue, make that your kind of evaluation or your analysis. The second to last one here, lack of peer review. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that actually in the primary process, candidates are eventually voted on by the people, which sounds great. Democracy, hooray, suffrage, universal suffrage, let's go for it, increased participation, we all love it. But this does mean that candidates are voted for by people that don't really know them. They know the media image, they know the leaflet, they know Make America Great Again, or whatever it might be. But a peer review is your peers are the people that know you and they work in the same place as you and they actually kind of have to work with you. And the primary process actually takes any kind of power away from them. Now you can say good, because if everyone's voted for by their peers, then actually you could kind of say, well, it's just the establishment, it's just that elite group all voting for someone they like, jobs for the boys, any kind of phrase you want to use. So you can easily knock this argument down. But you can also make the argument that an outsider like Donald Trump can come in with all of his potential flaws. And traditional politicians would say, whatever you do, don't let him in, but other people vote for him, and then you get a candidate who is perhaps unsuitable. I'm not saying Donald Trump is unsuitable, I'm saying you could make that argument. So the other issue here is you could argue that actually it should be the parties themselves that vote for their leaders, and then the public can choose between the parties. You can kind of make that as your argument. So is it good? Is it not good? You can make either argument. I think there's valid arguments on both sides and perhaps killer arguments on both sides. You just need to use the right examples and the right descriptions as you kind of go to kind of make that case. But if you were going to change it, what would you do? And there's basically three possibilities that have often been discussed. The first one is you could abolish caucuses and just keep primaries. You could kind of remove that kind of very, very low turnout method. It's quite out of date. You can encourage more kind of participation. You can make it anonymous. That's very important. You could also then stop the closed primaries to encourage a higher turnout and a higher participation more, to make it more that kind of America decides rather than this small group of party members decides. Although both of these arguments have their counter views, you could actually say, well, an open primary is bizarre for a party to allow other parties to kind of vote, or maybe if you really care about the Democratic Party, you should join the Democrats. You can counter these, but these are the possible reforms you could make. The other one that often comes up is changing the order that states vote. Remember that Iowa votes first and then New Hampshire, and this gives a very strange amount of focus on these two states. You could change that. So maybe you could rotate the order that states vote. So in one year, do it Iowa first, and then another year do Texas first, and rotate them like that. Maybe get them to vote in regional blocks, so all the Northeast and then all the Northwest. So one state doesn't particularly shine out more important than others, but kind of keep the focus around. Or maybe even get them all to go on the same day, if you can do it from a kind of an organizational perspective. I mean, one of the nice things about going one state and then another state and then another state is that it does allow candidates to drop out. It does allow there to be a narrative. It does allow candidates to be tested. It does allow for there to be a development of story and progress. It does allow an unknown candidate to come forward, or for a Barack to come up above Hillary. So there are advantages to spacing out the votes. But there's also disadvantages in terms of some people's votes basically count more than others. So you could get a question that asks you about possible reforms. You could get a question that asks you to evaluate the system in which you could possibly suggest that some of these reforms might kind of improve it. So we've discussed a lot there. We've talked about whether the primary system works, how the incumbents kind of affected it, and hopefully now you should have your own opinions on whether you like the system, whether you felt that the killer arguments were on the left side or the right side, and by doing some additional reading, filling in some examples, you should be able to write a decent essay looking at these particular topics. In the next video, we'll be looking at the role of the Vice President, and we'll be looking at the National Party conventions as we continue our journey through the US general election system. Thanks for watching. Hope you found it useful. Give the video a like, do some reading, and I'll see you in class.